Thank you. So my goals for today are to move on to the high latitude. So it's a little bit different than the schedule I provided Jim. So I hope you'll forgive me for that. So what I'd like to do today is introduce you to some of the phenomenology of high latitude variability in models and observations and give you some understanding of why it might matter. Also to understand how winds and temperature and salinity might come together to drive this variability. So I'm going to start off by looking at the North Atlantic and showing you a decadally smoothed picture of the temperature of the North Atlantic. And the top plot here, if you look at that plot, you will see variability, right? You see, first of all, that there's a trend there. But if we take away that trend, on top of that trend, there's a warming and cooling trend that it's not very strong. These temperatures are a few tenths of degrees, and yet it's significant in terms of being able to detect the long-term variability or long-term trend. And so one of the issues with high latitude climate change is that you can get these very long-term trends or long-term variability in climate in high latitudes that can complicate the detection of long-term variability. One thing that this is particularly important for is high latitude biology. So this plot, the plot on the left, shows the annual nominal catches of cod in Greenland waters. Now, the cod is a very, very important fish in history. It spurred much of the colonization of North America. And one of the great fisheries for cod is in the Labrador Sea and North Atlantic on the Georges Bank off of the coast of Canada. That fishery actually developed before the formal quote unquote discovery of the New World by Europeans. It was developed by Basque fishermen who settled on Newfoundland in the 1450s. And this shows catches of that Gadus morha, that Atlantic cod off of Greenland. Starting at about 1920, the Danish government provided Greenland with subsidies to do mechanized fishery. And there was this big boom in Greenland cod, catching 300,000 tons here. And then it goes down, and then sometime around here it collapses completely. And this collapse occurred at the same time as a collapse, or soon after this collapse. There was a collapse on the other side of the Atlantic in the fisheries off of Newfoundland, Atlantic Canada, that, as I say, wiped out a fishery that had been going at that point for 540 years. If you look at the temperature, you can see the temperature is rising around Greenland in the 1920s and then falling in the 1970s. This change in temperature, which is much larger than the changes over the Atlantic as a whole, is almost a 2-degree swing, peak to peak, is associated with changes in the delivery of fresh water, what are known as great salinity anomalies, propagating out of the Arctic and propagating around Greenland. Now, it could be that this is merely coincidental. It could be that the Danish government gave Greenlanders money to fish for cod. They caught all the fish went away. But it may also not be coincidental in that maybe the Greenlanders felt they could fish for cod because it was getting warmer. Doesn't really explain why they started it when they did. The other thing I want you to notice, though, is that the time period between these is very long. It's the trough here is about 1900, the trough here is about 1990. This is about 90 years apart. There are other things biologically that have similar long periods. For example, the giant squid Architeuthis there were a bunch of giant squid strandings here in the 1930s that were then not seen again until the 2000s. So there's this long period variability has quite a significant impact on ecosystems throughout the Atlantic. There's also seems to be some correlations between the number of hurricanes in the Atlantic and sea surface temperatures. So particularly if one looks in recent years, years with high sea surface temperatures tend to have higher temperatures in this wedge in the south here and this wedge in the north, and cooler temperatures in this wedge. And the idea that you would have more hurricanes in a region where at a time when waters off the US are actually a little cooler than normal is somewhat surprising. And the region with significant p-values, if you look at all of these, is this region here. So there's this sort of horseshoe of warming. There's some evidence for this variability in the Southern Ocean too, although less clear. This is a paper by Annika Reinches, who shows variability of convection in the Southern Ocean. And so this would be places where you find mixing to great depth in the wintertime. Then you can see that of the models that are in the last round of coupled model linear comparison, many of them have this convection in the in the Weddell Sea. This is Antarctica. This is the Weddell Sea. The Ross Sea over here. However, when we look at spectra of all of these models, and the first thing you should see is that this is a bit of a mess. There is a hint of the -2 spectrum at high levels, but there's also some hint of variability at, or so I should say high frequencies. This is up to 10 cycles per year. But at the multi-decadal centennial scale, 20 to 50 years, there's a few models that actually show periodic variability that seems to rise up above this. But it's not clear. Different models show it differently. Different models show the convection in different places. They have different frequencies. What's happening here? There is some evidence that this has happened. This is associated with changes. This convection is associated with changes in the fractional sea ice extent, from a paper by Hanna Zanowski. And some evidence that this is happening in nature in 1964. There was a weather satellite that went up for about 2 months before it failed, and it seemed to see an area of open water in the Weddell Sea. When the first weather satellites just actually last went up, and starting about 1975, one of the things they saw is this Weddell polynya, so-called. This polynya is quite large. This is, I think, about 1,000 kilometers across. And it was then not seen until 2017. So with about a 40-year time period. And this is during a time when the ozone hole is changing the path of the jet stream in the Southern Ocean, and the climate is warming, and the hydrological cycle is increasing. So we have maybe 2, maybe 3 instances of this. Are these actually part of the same convective event? We don't know. Is this convective event shut off because of just trying to make it through, but it's not quite making it through because of stratification? We don't know. So we have this variability in both hemispheres. How do we understand what might be driving it? I'm going to start off with the Atlantic overturning and remind you about climate modeling. So I know you've had a lecture about climate models. Just to remind you that climate models solve the equations of motion in both the atmosphere and ocean. For momentum, they use that momentum to transport the relevant state variables. In the atmosphere, that would be temperature and moisture. In the ocean, that would be temperature and salinity. They then compute pressures from the temperature and salinity. The pressures drive flows, or the pressure gradients drive flows. Those flows redistribute the temperature and pressure, and that cycle continues for as long as your computing holds out. This particular model I'm going to show you was one I helped develop at the Geophysical Fluid Dynamics Lab in Princeton with a small army of researchers. So there's 50 people on the documentation paper. I think I have 27 co-authors on the paper that describe the ocean model. And these models can then be run for very long periods of time to just look at the natural variability that you see. And because we have such short records in the polar regions compared to natural variability, these models become even more important, especially in terms of looking for mechanism. I should say that in the fourth assessment report, this model was one of the better models, and it had a pretty good overall simulation of hydrography in the Southern Ocean. In fact, probably the best one. A caveat, though, is that it doesn't directly simulate eddies. So if we look at the correlation between overturning and sea surface temperature in this model, we see this same horseshoe pattern. When the overturning is strong, it's warmer in the northern hemisphere, and then there's a region of correlation that wraps around into the tropics, and a cool region in between. This is exactly the same pattern as was seen to affect hurricane formation. If we take a 10-year smooth, the correlations go way up, particularly in the high latitudes, right? And start to show correlation over a much broader scale. And you can start to see pressure differences that develop. So in addition to we get a low pressure over Greenland. This would be associated with the Icelandic low, but we get a weakening of the Aleutian low. And so this is going to produce changes in the winds, it's going to produce changes in the jet stream. If we go to 20 years, now the region where the correlation is greater than 0.7 is much larger. We're starting to see influences through the entire northern hemisphere, and we're starting to pick up more significant negative correlations in the Pacific. And at century scale timescales, we have a very strong, now all of a sudden we're starting to get into the 0.4, 0.5 level of correlation over Pacific. And we're starting to see also changes in that are quite significant out here in the Central Pacific. Even starting to pick up some changes over India, right? And there are definite signals again of the development of of low pressure over the Atlantic and high pressure over the Pacific. Now, salinity shows a similar pattern as temperature. So this is the temperature on the left, and salinity on the right. But when we look at the correlations, they're even stronger. We're getting correlations above 0.9 throughout this region. Okay, so in the model, at least, salinity seems to play a pretty big role in driving this long period variability. Interestingly, we don't see that much of it. We start to see some signals in the Arctic as well, although they're not really as clear. Okay. So in addition to Atlantic variability, so the idea coming out of this is that Atlantic variability seems to be driven by changes in the overturning circulation, which is what I talked to you about in the first lecture. And it also seems to be driven by coupled changes in the the temperature and salinity. Changes in possibly driven by changes in hydrological cycling, possibly driven by changes in winds. We haven't come to a conclusion about that. How would we go about answering that question? One of the things that you should have learned by now is that the climate system is complex and interconnected, and that in order to answer these questions, it becomes really important to figure out ways to reduce the dimensionality of the system. And I know you've also had a talk about about machine learning, which I hope to go back and watch. For me, as a climate modeler, one of the big promises of machine learning is that it can help us reduce the dimensionality of the system and figure out what simple dynamics are at play, or simpler dynamics are at play. I'm just starting to do that now for the Atlantic overturning. So I want to switch gears now and go to the south and present another series of studies. This series of studies was conducted within a climate model that was a coarse resolution version of the one that you just saw. It's a model that has a realistic representation of wide range of physical processes. And it turned out when we first submitted this papers on this, we were told it's a coarse resolution model. It's, a toy model. Why are you wasting our time? How good is simulation of the Southern Ocean? So we compared it to the CMIP5 models and found that it was better than 2/3 of them, maybe 80% of them in terms of its model Antarctic circumpolar current transport, and also the mean density across the circumpolar current. Again, though, the low resolution means that the mixing due to eddies has to be parameterized, and this was a model with relatively low parameterized lateral diffusion in the Southern Ocean. Caveat with all of these models, even the ones that go out to relatively high resolution, is that very few of them actually capture the dynamics of overflows, these waterfalls that go into the deep ocean from places like the Mediterranean and the Greenland, Iceland, Norwegian Sea, but also the Persian Gulf and the Red Sea, which I may talk about tomorrow. So this shows the model. Over here, I took the variability and I smoothed out the interannual variability. I looked at the decadal variability. And if you look at decadal variability, you can see that even on decadal timescales, there is still some variability in the Southern Ocean. But the bulk of variability is then found in high latitudes. Right here is variability that in a little bit we'll see is associated with the overturning. This is associated with the Gulf Stream, across which there's something like as much as a 20-degree change in temperature, shifting northward and southwards. But the big thing that leaps out at your eye is this region here in the Southern Ocean, where we have lots of interdecadal variability. If we look at the temperature anomalies in that region, what we see is that it's relatively periodic. We have periods of where the deep warms up and then it gets cold, and the deep warms up and then it gets cold, and the deep warms up and then it gets cold. And we might think that this is a mechanism for driving overturning. It's what has been referred to as a recharge-discharge oscillator, where this part of the Southern Ocean, the surface is cold and fresh, the deep is warm and salty. So what happens is that the surface cools down, the deep heats up, and at some point the warm water in the deep gets light enough that it bursts through the barrier. I have the mixed layer shown here. Sorry, no, that's a zero line. Bursts through the barrier, brings cold, warm, salty water up to the surface, and that's what's driving the overturning. However, if we look at the annually smooth density anomaly, what we see is that, or actually first let's look at salinity, we see that this water, in addition to being warm, is also salty. And the water surface is salty when there's convection, and so when there's convection, salty water gets brought up to the surface and you lose salt here. So when it's cold here, it's fresh. When it's warm, it's salty. Those two things actually work in opposite directions. If we look at density, what we see is that these convective time periods are when the surface is denser, are really driven by the salt at the surface, not the temperature. And the big anomalies are at the surface rather than at depth. Now, if you were to look very carefully, you would see that the salinity of the anomaly at the surface actually slightly leads the convection. You can't really see that here. But the changes in density appear to be driven from the surface rather than from deep. So how do we reduce this to a comprehensible system? Well, it's something that has been used in the climate community now for almost 70 years, and it is now considered part of artificial intelligence and machine learning, but Ed Lorenz started using it in 1956. It's the idea of empirical orthogonal functions. And so empirical orthogonal functions are similar to principal components. The idea is that you identify the major axes of variability. So if you imagine plotting temperature from a bunch of different points against each other, and you get this massive point cloud in n-dimensional space, there's going to be some axis along which that point cloud is the most elongated, that captures the most variance of that point cloud. That axis, which can be mapped onto a pattern in space, is the first empirical orthogonal function. This corresponds basically to computing a covariance matrix, looking at the covariance in time between different points and taking the eigenvectors of that matrix. So the first principal component, or EOF, captures the most variance, the second has the next most variance, et cetera. And those principal components are obliged to be at right angles to each other, which can actually be a little bit of a problem. More often what's done in the climate community is to rotate those components so that once you have a set of axes, you can rotate the components so that each component's spatial mapping is maximally localized. Okay. The key thing here is this reduces the dimensionality of the system. We can then look at how changes in the modes are related to changes in other modes and find principal oscillation patterns. So if I have 5 principal components, I can take the rate of change of that and construct a series of linear equations where I map it onto the states of the other principal components. That's a matrix equation that has, that matrix itself has eigenvalues, and I can look to see what kinds of oscillation patterns develop from that. So we did this for our model, and what we found was that the first mode of salinity, its temperature and salinity, joint variability, is shown here. Here's the LC. So this is our convective mode. It lines up perfectly with our convective mode. Okay. So the idea is that there's a pattern of variability where you have warming and salinification of the LC. Okay. Turns out that there's the third mode of variability. There's a pattern where, and it's somewhat difficult to see here. If you look at this line here, it's here. So what you're seeing is that the warming seems to move northwards and a freshening develops all around along the prime meridian here. Okay, so the warming is offset, and when you get freshening and salinification, the warming and salinification move to the north, and a fresh anomaly develops along the prime meridian. If we look at the time series of these two variables, we can see that, so this is the amplitude of the first mode. This is the amplitude of the third mode. You can see that they're offset, right? And you can also see that they're periodic. Okay. And so we note the first and third EOFs are out of phase, and we can fit this with an oscillatory analysis where the amplitude of the first mode turns out to have a positive relationship with itself. So the first mode, once you start convecting, you tend to convect more. That's reasonable, right? But you tend to create a negative anomaly for the third mode. Or you tend to be damped by the third mode, sorry. However, when you convect, you tend to create a negative anomaly for that third mode, which is itself damped. And so this is a coupled oscillator equation. You can solve for it, and you get a period of about 57 years. If we go back here, this period is about 50. Okay. So what we see is that we get convection in this region that drives freshening in this region, which then drives a shutoff of convection in this region. So convection in the wet LC brings warm, salty water to the surface, results in compressing with warm water to the north, fresh water to the east. The fresh water then convects into the wet LC and shuts off the convection. The likely driver of this change, when we looked at the term budgets, is wind stress. So if we look at what happens when there's more heating of the wet LC, and we look at the mixing from below, we see there's enhanced mixing of salt up from below, but there's reduced mixing of salt throughout this region. And right here is where we end up developing our fresh anomaly along. And we can also see that this corresponds to changes in wind stress. When we have convection in the wet LC, we tend to warm the region around Antarctica by around a degree. This tends to shift the winds northwards, and you can see that northward shift here. Okay. We look at this in water mass space. This is another way of showing it. Here's the salinity, here's the temperature. The density levels are shown going from dense to light. The modern ocean, I believe, is shown here. Okay. What we find in this model is that in our off state, which is over here, stronger winds tend to build up heat and salt below. It's still cold in the winter. We then, at some point, sorry, this is the density of the deep water here. At some point, we get dense enough so that we start to convect. We convect until we reach the deep water, which is warmer and saltier. As that happens, the difference between the blue line here, which is the eastern Wood LC, and the red line, which is the western Wood LC, gets bigger and bigger. And as it gets bigger and bigger, you can see that the eastern Wood LC becomes much fresher than the western Wood LC. The circulation there tends to carry water from the eastern Woodell into the western Woodell. So this starts to freshen, and then they both drop down here. So the eastern Woodell tracks around this circle. The western Woodell goes back and forth, swings back and forth. Okay. The feedback diagram that emerges is complex. Basic idea is that when you have deep convection of the Woodell Sea, it warms. This, I should say, these feedback diagrams have arrows when there is a positive relationship, so that an increase in one thing causes an increase in another. They have circles where there's a negative relationship. So an increase in one thing causes a decrease in another. So the deep convection of the Weddell Sea has two impacts. First, it increases the sea surface temperature in the western Weddell and eastern Weddell, but it also makes the eastern Weddell salinity higher than the western Weddell salinity by reducing vertical mixing there. This higher salinity leads to more cooling and evaporation, which then drives the deep convection. So here's our positive feedback loop. The higher salinity also reduces westerly winds to the east of the convection, which both changes the vertical mixing of salt in the eastern Weddell and increases the advective supply of salinity to the western Weddell with about a 9-year propagation. So this loop and this loop are negative feedback loops with lags in them. And so that's exactly what you would need to get an oscillation. Turns out that this whole process is quite sensitive to changing the lateral mixing. I showed you a case here, which has this beautiful oscillation. However, our control case of the model looks much more irregular. The convection is much more irregular. You're looking at temperature in the Weddell Sea with depth and time. And here's the summertime mixed layer depth. We can see these convective cases develop nicely in the case that we just looked at. But if I change my parameterizations, I can make the model irregular. If I make the eddy diffusion really high, so I mix lots of salt into the surface waters, I can just basically wipe out the oscillation altogether, or I can turn it off by allowing eddies to flatten isopycnals more effectively. And a brief analysis of why that's true, looking at the evolution of September water masses. If I make the lateral diffusion very strong, I basically pin myself in the on state, and if I make the lateral effective eddies advection very strong, I pin myself in the off state. What happens interestingly there is that the main mode of variability shifts from the Weddell Sea sector to the Ross Sea sector. And we saw some hint of that in Anand work, and that some models actually have convection here rather than here. An interesting point is that I showed you that there's lots of variability about in terms of whether the models produce this mode of periodic variability or convective variability in the Southern Ocean. The models have very different values for their mixing coefficients. So how they represent eddies is really important in determining this large-scale driver of climate variability. So because we have a very short record, we can't really look at whether this is a realistic mechanism or not. Maybe in another 20, 30 years, we'll have the record to know. However, we can look at whether various parts of the feedback diagram are realistic. So this is showing the sea surface, the relationship between sea surface temperature and the Weddell Sea and westerly winds. And does the model characterize such a relationship properly? Well, it turns out that that relationship changes the height gradient, the geopotential height gradient between the tropics and the high latitude. So if we look at how high do we have to go in the atmosphere to get the 200 millibar surface? The model basically predicts that, and I realize this is a very poor quality rendering, but you can see that there's a point cloud that goes from high values here to low values here. The geopotential height, as the geopotential height difference drops, the momentum flux changes. The dashed line here is the slope of that line historically. So the model captures this very important part of the dynamics, this relationship between geopotential height and the delivery of momentum to the Southern Ocean through the atmosphere, the lateral momentum transport that then is taken out by stress at the surface. We can also look at whether advective salinity flux to the Weddell Sea drives convection of the Weddell Sea. And Ethan Campbell, in a paper that came out in Nature in 2019, looked at the convection in the Weddell Sea. You can see the convection happening sometime around here. We're looking at salinity, and what Ethan found was that the shutoff of the turn on and shut off of that convection seems to be actually driven by an advective salinity flux. Okay, so in the last couple minutes of this talk, I'm going to turn back to the Atlantic and ask if we can apply this mechanism to the Atlantic. So far, we've only really looked at it in one model. This is the Goddard Institute for Space Studies E2 model. Here's some time series of overturning in that model with the red line at 40 degrees north and the blue line at 30 degrees north. And you can see that there's definitely changes in the overturning. The overturning is going from about 23 to 28, so a change of about 20% over, this is time in years, so this would be over about 5-10 years, and then it drops, and then it goes back up, and then drops, and goes back up. And you can see that this change is actually propagating. There's a delay between when it's happening at 40 north and when it's observed at 30 north, and wouldn't you know it, our observations are not at 40 north near the convective regions, they're at 30 north. So this time delay in actually detecting changes in overturning is part of what we have to deal with as oceanographers. So we've got this, as I'll point out later, this model is interesting because it also shows tipping point behavior under low CO2 forcing. So when we do a modal analysis, modes are shown here. It turns out that, again, these modes, we can find modes of temperature and salinity that are related to each other. There's a temperature mode where we have cooling over much of the Atlantic. So this would presumably be a convective off mode and a little bit of freshening. And the second temperature mode is cooling off. This is North America. That would be Newfoundland. And so what happens is that the cold waters here penetrate a little bit farther south. And so you see cold and fresh waters coming further to the south. An anomaly like this was probably what caused that collapse of the Newfoundland cod in 1991. Now, it turns out that an increase in this mode tends to be associated with negative mode too. So as the convection turns off in the central Labrador Sea, this we tend to warm here, but a warming in this region tends to be associated with a positive trend here. So we actually have exactly the same dynamics for an oscillator. So this is something that we are still working on. I'm going to be working on this summer, trying to understand the term balances that lead to these changes. If we actually do a full modal analysis with the first 10 modes, mirrors the analysis where we have in-phase temperature and salinity looking like this, and out-of-phase temperature and salt looking like this. So we tend to produce oscillations of temperature and salinity that are associated with change, and these are, when you look at them, are definitely associated with changes in the overturning. However, when we actually try to do a dynamical oscillation with a linear eigenvalue analysis, our model produces a prediction for the period that's 50 years. Go back here. This is clearly not a 50-year oscillation. In the model, it's 20, which is probably too fast. So the period's off, and so one of the questions we're thinking about is whether there's a sense of nonlinearity, and there are various machine learning methods where instead of fitting linear relationships, you fit nonlinear relationships that we're exploring to see whether we can get a better representation of this. Additionally, we're starting to examine the projections of this in the in a couple models. Now, again, here's our feedback mechanism. Anomalous salinity in our convective region seems to be associated with anomalous convection and overturning, which produces changes in the atmospheric and oceanic circulation, which produces anomalous salinity in a remote region, which feeds back. And so there's a delay oscillator again. We're still trying to figure out how this works, but the basic idea is similar to what we saw in the Southern Ocean. So I've mentioned the analysis predicts too far period, too long a period. But an additional question that we have, if we look at this model going forward in time, it predicts a very sharp decline of the overturning. And then some of the versions of the model, that overturning recovers, and some of them it doesn't and continues to be off up to 2400. And in some, it takes a long time, centuries, to come back. This is at 26.5 north. This is at 48 north. This is fascinating, right? What's driving this? Can the modal analysis help explain it? Now, preliminary work suggests that the modes are different as we warm the planet. So the original modal structure, which I don't expect you to remember, showed relatively little impact of salinity in the Arctic. However, when we look at modes from the modern simulation from the last 50 years, we find that if we take that ensemble and we look across the ensemble, we get enough statistical power to look at the modern modal structure. And what we find then is that as the overturning increases and you warm the Atlantic, that warmth actually starts to produce salinity anomalies in the Arctic. And insofar as we showed earlier that changes in circulation produce changes in pressure systems, what may be happening here is that in cold climates, the Icelandic low, those changes in the pressure are bringing air in from Northern Europe that's pretty cold. And so you blow cold air over the ice, it doesn't change very much. But in warm climates, the air may be warm enough to generate variability in ice melt, which may be generating variability in salinity that can help turn off the circulation. Additionally, there's a recent paper that suggests that the GISS model is very, very sensitive to winds. So this shows a sensitivity to winds across the different coupled climate models. The GISS model is out here, it's an outlier. And so in terms of that feedback loop, from temperature to winds to salinity, the GISS model may have a very strong coupling in part of that loop. So again, one of the things we want to do is look across these models and see if we can do the same analysis and see if looking at the modal analysis gives us a more mechanistic understanding of what's happening. So some conclusions here. Long period polar variability on the decadal to centennial scale is hinted at in lots of observations, but our observational record is generally too short. It appears in some, but not all models in both northern and southern hemisphere. I had a study in 2014 where I compared two versions of the GFDL model, one with a density coordinate ocean model and one with a level coordinate ocean model, and they had very different overturning variabilities in the northern hemisphere, despite having identical sea ice, atmosphere, and land ice and land models. So details of physics really matter for this, and details of uncertain physics really matter for this. We can show that oscillator theory we've shown that oscillator theory can be fit to one model in one hemisphere, and which suggests coupling between temperatures, winds, and salinity. A lot more needs to be done to see if this is a productive way of understanding the variability across models and constraining the emergent parameters that need to be constrained to understand this theory. And some key questions remain regarding tipping points. In general, when we've looked at tipping points in models, but we don't have a lot of data. We know that these are things that we would really like to avoid, but we don't know why some models produce tipping points and others do not. So a bunch of questions that I hope your generation of scientists will help us answer. And so I'm going to stop there and thank you for your attention again.